I was standing in the corner of my sister's engagement party, holding a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, when Vivian turned to her group of perfectly manicured friends and said loudly enough for half the room to hear, "At least now you can see why I was always the pretty sister. Look at her standing over there like some awkward librarian who forgot to take off her reading glasses." The laughter that followed felt like ice water in my veins, and I watched as her fiancé Jonathan shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing to defend me. In that moment, surrounded by 60 people who'd just witnessed my own sister publicly humiliate me at what was supposed to be a family celebration, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. I reached into my purse, pulled out the small wrapped gift I'd brought for the happy couple, and realized that sometimes the most devastating revenge comes disguised as generosity. Because what Vivian didn't know was that Jonathan had been texting me for 3 months, and the screenshots of every flirtatious message were printed and tucked inside that innocent-looking wedding planning journal I was about to present to her. My name is Celeste Brennan, and I've spent the last 4 years of my life building something most people in my family still don't quite understand: a successful freelance graphic design business that allows me to work from my converted garage studio in Austin, Texas. The space smells like coffee and printer ink, with afternoon sunlight streaming through skylights I installed myself and casting geometric shadows across the drafting table where I sketch preliminary concepts by hand before moving to my computer setup. My clients range from small local businesses needing logo designs to national companies requiring complete brand overhauls, and there's a quiet satisfaction in taking someone's abstract vision and making it tangible, visual, memorable. I keep a wall of printed samples from my favorite projects: a minimalist logo for an organic soap company, packaging designs for a craft brewery, a complete visual identity for a nonprofit animal rescue. Most evenings, you'll find me at Epic Coffee on North Loop, a 24-hour place with mismatched furniture and walls covered in local art. I claim the same corner table when possible, spreading out sketches and color swatches while nursing a single cappuccino for hours. The baristas know my order by heart, and the late-night regulars, graduate students, musicians, insomniacs, have become a kind of chosen family that appreciates creative work without questioning why I'm not following a more traditional career path. At family gatherings, I'm usually the one with a camera, documenting celebrations while staying slightly outside the main action. I've always preferred observing to performing, listening to talking, creating to consuming. My sister Vivian has never understood this preference, interpreting my quieter nature as social awkwardness rather than intentional choice. But what my family doesn't realize is that being the observer means you notice things other people miss. And sometimes, those observations become very useful information. If this resonates with your own family dynamics, make sure you're subscribed. These stories exist for a reason. The dynamic between Vivian and me was established long before we understood what sibling rivalry actually meant. She's 3 years older, blessed with the kind of effortless beauty that makes strangers do double takes on the street: glossy dark hair, green eyes, a smile that photographs perfectly from every angle. I inherited our father's more angular features and our mother's tendency toward introversion, which in our family somehow translated to being seen as the less successful daughter. Growing up, Vivian was homecoming queen, prom queen, the girl who dated the captain of the football team and got accepted to her first-choice university with a partial scholarship for her involvement in student government. I was the kid who spent lunch periods in the art room, won academic awards that nobody talked about at dinner, and chose a state school specifically because they had an excellent design program. Our parents never explicitly compared us, but the implications were always there in the way they bragged about Vivian's social successes while describing my achievements as nice hobbies. When Vivian got engaged to Jonathan last spring, the family celebration felt like validation of everything they'd always believed about which daughter was winning at life. Jonathan seemed different from her usual boyfriends, quieter, more thoughtful, with a job as a software engineer that suggested depth beyond surface-level charm. When I met him at family dinners, he'd ask genuine questions about my design work, showing interest in creative processes that Vivian dismissed as something I did to keep myself busy until I found a real career. The first inappropriate text came 2 months after their engagement announcement. Just a simple message saying he'd been thinking about our conversation regarding typography and user experience design. Then gradually more personal comments about how refreshing it was to talk to someone who understood the technical aspects of visual communication. I should have stopped responding immediately, but there was something seductive about being seen as interesting, intelligent, worth pursuing. Especially by someone who was supposed to be completely devoted to my sister. By the time the messages became clearly flirtatious, I had 3 months of evidence that my future brother-in-law was not the faithful partner everyone believed him to be. The engagement party was held at my parents' house in Westlake Hills, with the backyard transformed into something from a wedding magazine, string lights wrapped around oak trees, cocktail tables covered in ivory linens, floral arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Vivian had spent weeks planning every detail, determined to create an event that would generate the perfect social media content and establish her status as someone who knew how to celebrate properly. I'd arrived early to help with setup, wearing a simple black dress and minimal makeup, my usual approach to family events. I brought my camera to document the evening, partly out of habit and partly because staying behind the lens gives you a legitimate reason to avoid extended small talk. The trouble started around 8 p.m., when Vivian had reached that particular level of wine consumption that makes her feel clever and uninhibited. She was holding court near the dessert table, surrounded by her sorority sisters and coworkers from the marketing firm where she worked, regaling them with stories about wedding planning stress and how lucky she was to have found Jonathan. That's when someone mentioned how nice it was that both sisters would be settled soon, asking if I was dating anyone seriously. The question was innocent enough, but it triggered something in Vivian that had been building all evening. Maybe jealousy over the attention I'd been getting from some of Jonathan's friends who were curious about my design work. Maybe insecurity about the fact that her fiancé had spent 20 minutes discussing creative software with me instead of mingling with her chosen social circle. Her response came out loud and sharp, cutting through the ambient party noise like glass breaking. She gestured toward where I stood adjusting my camera settings and delivered her assessment of why she'd always been the pretty sister, complete with the awkward librarian comparison that made everyone within earshot turn to look at me. The laughter that followed wasn't malicious from most of them. They were following Vivian's social cue, trying to be part of her moment. But it landed like a collective slap anyway. 60 people simultaneously acknowledging that yes, I was the less attractive sister, the one whose appearance was worth public commentary and amusement. Jonathan stood 3 feet away from her when it happened, close enough to hear every word, positioned where he could have easily deflected or redirected the conversation. Instead, he looked down at his drink and said nothing, protecting his relationship with my sister over basic human decency toward me. That's when I decided the screenshots in my purse had found their purpose. I excused myself to the bathroom and spent 5 minutes staring at my reflection in my parents' powder room mirror, trying to process what had just happened. The woman looking back at me wasn't ugly. She had interesting bone structure, expressive eyes, the kind of understated elegance that doesn't photograph well for Instagram, but commands respect in professional settings. But for 30 seconds in that backyard, I'd been reduced to nothing more than an unfavorable comparison, a prop in my sister's performance of superiority. The worst part wasn't the public humiliation. It was the realization that this dynamic had been building for years, and I'd been complicit in it by staying quiet, by being the accommodating sister who didn't make waves, who absorbed small cruelties without fighting back because maintaining family peace felt more important than defending my own dignity. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the message thread with Jonathan, months of conversations where he'd praised my intelligence, my creativity, my insights into design and technology. Messages where he'd complained about Vivian's superficial concerns, her obsession with appearances over substance. Conversations where he'd flirted increasingly boldly, testing whether I might be interested in something beyond intellectual exchange. In those messages, I wasn't the awkward librarian sister. I was fascinating, worthy of pursuit, someone whose thoughts and opinions mattered enough to seek out regularly. The contrast between how Jonathan saw me privately and how he'd just allowed me to be treated publicly crystallized something important, I deserved better than being anyone's secret admiration or public embarrassment. I reached into my purse and pulled out the wedding planning journal I'd wrapped earlier that day, the one containing printed screenshots of every inappropriate conversation. The gift that was about to teach both of them what happened when you underestimated the quiet sister who noticed everything. My original plan had been much simpler. When Jonathan's messages first crossed the line from friendly to inappropriate, I'd planned to tell Vivian privately, sister to sister, giving her the information she needed to make informed decisions about her relationship. I'd even drafted the conversation in my head multiple times, gentle but clear, focused on her well-being rather than my own vindication. But every time I'd started to bring it up, something stopped me. Partly it was cowardice, fear of becoming the messenger who gets shot, the sister who ruins the fairy tale engagement. But mostly it was the growing realization that Vivian wouldn't believe me, or worse, would find a way to blame me for encouraging Jonathan's attention. So instead, I decided to document everything methodically. I screenshot every inappropriate message, noting dates and contexts. I saved voicemails where he'd called me late at night, ostensibly to discuss design projects, but really to complain about feeling unappreciated by Vivian. I even had photos he'd sent from business trips, innocent enough individually, but part of a pattern of seeking emotional intimacy with someone other than his fiancé. The wedding planning journal had been a stroke of inspiration. Vivian had mentioned wanting a special place to keep track of vendor information, guest lists, and timeline details. I'd found a beautiful leather-bound journal at a local bookstore, something that looked thoughtful and sisterly, the kind of gift that would make me appear supportive of her upcoming marriage. Inside the front cover, I'd included a sweet note about wishing her happiness and offering my design services for any wedding materials she might need. Then, tucked between pages 10 and 11, I'd placed 20 pages of printed screenshots, organized chronologically, with a simple handwritten note, "I thought you should know what kind of man you're marrying." My first moment of doubt came when I saw how happy she looked opening other gifts, how genuinely excited she seemed about planning her future with Jonathan. For a few minutes, I considered taking the journal back, finding some other way to handle the situation that wouldn't destroy her special evening. But then she delivered her public assessment of my appearance, and my hesitation evaporated completely. The gift presentation happened during the natural lull after dinner, when people were settling into dessert and the evening's energy was shifting from mingling to more intimate conversations. Vivian had positioned herself in the center of the backyard, surrounded by wrapped packages and glowing from the combination of wine and sustained attention. I approached with my camera in one hand and the journal in the other, playing the role of the thoughtful sister who wanted to document this special moment. I made a point of complimenting her dress, her party planning skills, how beautiful everything looked, establishing myself as supportive and loving before delivering the gift that would change everything. When I handed her the journal, I emphasized how much thought had gone into choosing something she could use throughout her engagement and wedding planning process. Something personal and meaningful that would help her stay organized during what I knew would be a stressful time ahead. Vivian unwrapped it with genuine enthusiasm, running her fingers over the leather cover and flipping through the first few pages while commenting on how perfect it was, how thoughtful I'd been to find something so beautiful and practical. She even apologized, in her way, for the earlier comment about my appearance, claiming she'd had too much champagne and sometimes said things she didn't mean when she was excited. The moment of discovery came about 10 minutes later, when she was showing the journal to Jonathan and some of his friends, explaining how she was going to use it to track vendor payments and timeline details. I watched from across the yard as she found the screenshots, saw her face change from confusion to recognition to something that looked like physical nausea. Jonathan noticed her expression shift before anyone else did, moving closer to see what had caused such a dramatic change in her demeanor. When he saw his own text messages printed in black and white, his face went completely pale, and he immediately started trying to guide Vivian away from the other guests. But she was past the point of discreet conversation. In a voice that carried across the entire backyard, she asked him to explain why he'd been telling her sister that she was shallow and image-obsessed, and why he'd been asking for private meetings to discuss design projects that didn't exist. The party ended abruptly, with guests making awkward excuses and collecting their purses while Vivian and Jonathan had what would turn out to be their final conversation as an engaged couple. I packed up my camera equipment and left without saying goodbye to anyone, knowing that whatever happened next needed to unfold without my presence complicating the situation. The next morning, my phone was full of messages from family members who wanted to understand what had happened and whether I'd been having an affair with Jonathan. I spent most of Sunday writing careful responses that explained the situation without seeming defensive or vindictive, acknowledging his inappropriate behavior while making it clear that I'd never reciprocated or encouraged his advances. Vivian didn't speak to me for 3 weeks. When she finally called, her voice was different, smaller, less certain, missing the confident edge that had characterized most of our adult interactions. She'd broken off the engagement, she said. Not because of the messages themselves, but because of what they revealed about Jonathan's character and her own judgment. The conversation we had that day was unlike any we'd shared as adults. She apologized for the public humiliation at her party, acknowledging that she'd been performing for her friends rather than considering my feelings. I apologized for not finding a private way to share the information about Jonathan, recognizing that my method had been designed more for dramatic impact than for her emotional well-being. 3 months later, I was back at Epic Coffee with my laptop and sketchpad when Vivian appeared at my usual corner table, holding 2 cappuccinos and looking nervous. She'd started therapy, she said, to understand why she'd built so much of her identity around being prettier, more social, more conventionally successful than her younger sister. It was the beginning of a different kind of relationship between us, one built on honesty rather than competition. 6 months after the engagement party, Vivian and I have coffee together most Tuesday mornings, usually at Epic, sometimes at other places around Austin that she started exploring since her social circle shifted after her breakup. She's begun taking photography classes and asks genuine questions about composition and lighting, approaching creative work with the same intensity she once brought to party planning. The dynamic between us has fundamentally changed, but not in the way I expected when I tucked those screenshots into her wedding journal. I thought I was delivering justice, proving a point about underestimating the quiet sister. What actually happened was more complex and ultimately more valuable. We both learned that our relationship had been built on performance rather than genuine connection. Vivian recently told me that the hardest part of ending her engagement wasn't losing Jonathan, but realizing how much energy she'd spent constructing an identity that required other people to be lesser versions of themselves. The night she called me ugly at her party, she said, she'd been trying to shore up her own insecurities by diminishing mine. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destruction, it's creating space for everyone involved to become more honest versions of themselves, even when that honesty is initially painful for everyone involved.